Hello everyone. My name is Mary Georgescu and my thesis is Spice of Life. So what Spice of Life is actually a narrative video game. And it's a story about a line cook robot that desires to become human in order to be allowed to interact with humans as a chef. So, this is some of my earlier work, usually sculptures and tattoos of mythic creatures, specifically dragons. Even before I really understood that I wanted to be a storyteller, I was very obsessed with vindicating the negative image around really brutal imaginary creatures such as dragons. So that's where I started. And even with Spice of Life, I'm combating this idea that AI are somehow a threat to human life. So I started sculpting at the same time as I was a barista at Think Coffee, and it was there where these thoughts of humanity started to trickle in. It was interesting to me that somehow people find it appropriate to treat you somewhat less than human when you're providing a service. This sometimes mindless act of getting sustenance and beverages is a great part of what inspired my bleak environment for this thesis, and kind of the attitudes that you get from the characters that you interact with as Unit 25. So these are some of my print works. I largely experimented with a mixture of photography, a mixture of form and word. I was doing a lot of surreal work. In the past, I was trying to deal with emotions, really, that I was feeling coming from a background of mechanical engineering, taking a 180 and doing art instead. There were a lot of people that were kind of skeptical, and there was, with everyone that's spoken, there was this period of depression where art really saved my life. So this was some more of the work. It was very freeing to just be able to express myself and get these subconscious worlds out into an actual form. And then something very interesting happened. Words started to creep into my work, and then I started combining words with three-dimensional objects, with colors, and I started to really think about Persepolis, which I read in high school, and how beautiful of a story that was and how dark of a story that was. So I went back to thinking about comics. Even while I was doing pottery, I was still combining, even in this whistle, it was like a form and function and story kind of thing. This is some more busts that I made. One of the philosopher Rousseau, just putting his words across his chest. Everything started to become more playful the more that I tackled these things within myself, and very humorous as well. So this was my last work before applying for the program, where I was again combining form and function, and the characters that I was developing in my work really started to gain traction and stories of their own. I was also very seriously thinking about who I am as an artist and how I could brand myself. So going from, what is this here? Left to right was kind of the progression of my logo or my brand. And it's inspired, originally it was inspired by nonsense, which I thought my work was going to be, this reflective, funny, crazy work, to really going back to my roots, being a Romanian American. So I also started working with clients in undergrad, and it was really fun. They were really kooky guys that wanted quite a lot, and I think that's when I really realized I need to go back to school, even though I had just left school. It was like a few months. And I wanted to not just do something that was commercial. I really wanted to focus on this story that had been slowly working its way into everything that I did. So coming into the program, I tackled some really interesting projects, and this was our digital short story For digital short story, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit to give you an idea. I was really obsessed with Icelandic and Nordic gods. So I wanted to go to Iceland, and I really wanted to do research not just about the mythology of the characters there, but also about like what is life like in a place that was so steeped in that mythos. So I started to develop a protagonist that considers herself a modern-day Valkyrie. So this story, 12-page, was like the first comic I've ever made at all. And on top of that, at the same time, I was going back to what I was doing with ceramics, which was doing everything by hand. So this was a laser-cut book. Everything was then glued together. It was a very custom piece, and I really wanted the material to speak to the story, and vice versa. I was also working at the Visible Futures Lab, and I got to experiment with a lot of crazy stuff while I was there. And I think that just freedom and ability to play with any material that you could possibly imagine informed my work going forward. So these were like some little mini books that I had made in practice for the thesis book, which can't tell you how many times I've broken that thing because the spine is very fragile. It was just made out of like one bent piece of wood. So some more projects that I worked on, although I think it's going to give Jim a heart attack that I put the Y files back up on the large screen. This was like a little 4-section animation made with the pixel aesthetic to try to tell a story, even though it was like a very comical one and probably not something very serious. And then we even worked on writing a script from scratch. I mean, these are all things that are really crazy, and I've never done any of this at all. So I made a horror story, you know, as you know. And then on another project, I went back and made a GIF with historical images called Christmas Comrade about the dictators in Romania. So that's all like on my site for you to look at later. But it was all stuff that will lead to what I did. And the second bakery attack, which was another experimentation with GIF work. So throughout all of this, my humor really still stuck in there. And when we were thinking about the thesis, I honestly had a really difficult subject matter to pitch. I was thinking about doing something related to the Roma or the Gypsies in Romania and talking about that, the fact that they're constantly on the move and the kind of cultural climate that there is in Europe surrounding them. And that's all really, really heavy. And I think like everyone in the program, you really want to work on something that's not going to drain you and make it very difficult. Although I appreciate it, I'm so happy that you guys did that and like really pushed your stories and told personal narratives like that. Like I think I would have lost my mind because I was already at that point before entering the program. So I went back and I looked at some things that I considered fun and funny, going back to the animation and pixel work. And what I really appreciate about Scott Pilgrim is that it was a comic originally, and then it was transformed into a film, the same script, and then turned into a video game. And this game, called Papers, Please, which I have never stopped talking about, was the first game when I really realized that story could be told, a very serious story could be told in a simple game. So Papers, Please by Lucas Pope is the story of a man who is in a passport booth, and as he engages with the players that have to go through the border of this country that's in political turmoil, you get to experience like the things about their lives that also kind of change you as you're playing. So it's a 30-day story where you're only ever playing in this booth and only ever stamping their passports or the things that they slip into you. So going forward, I actually experienced my character in a quite different way. I was physically my character at one point in the summer. Originally, Unit 25 was a homicidal maniac that wanted to experiment with different tastes and taste buds and things like that. So I was really wondering, like, is this even going to be possible? I don't know. Let's see. But then I thought back to, like, the playfulness. These are some of the Boston Dynamic robots, and just the character that comes through in these inanimate objects is, like, so great to me. And it's really sad, like, you can see online, like, they just kick the robots over as testing, but they have so much personality to them. So in my own work, this is the character, Unit 25, that has had several facelifts after this. But it's maintaining that humor while keeping the serious tone of what I originally thought maybe was like a political uprising or something, and then I kind of toned it down from there. But these were some of the original concepts of, like, okay, I know I want to keep it within one frame and have characters come up to me and engage me. So the world in which Buffalo Run is slightly in the future, and I only say slightly in the future because you can't really automatically tell the differences until you engage the customers and see that, oh, they're only obsessed with, like, vitamin pills or protein. Very different future. You can't really have, like, a cooked meal. It's all about it being efficient and being speedy and getting on with your life. And as you progress through the story, you find out these characters are living in a post-apocalyptic robot war world. Yeah, where AI have previously already decimated the world, and they have some strong reservations about you feeding them food. So these were some original designs that I was thinking of as the style. I was thinking about doing it a little bit like Art Deco. I wasn't quite sure, and then when we finally solidified it, I saw that even in very simple silhouettes, you can get a lot of character just from the silhouettes alone. I should also say that it is a 5-day game where you play as this robot going through the transformations as he's going towards humanity. So you start off as a little guy, and then eventually your form becomes more organic and more human-like until you reach the final stage in which you have the choice whether or not to remain at that restaurant, go open your own restaurant, or save the guy that has been put in jail because of you, essentially. And the characters that come towards you respond through Twitter. They're not really open characters. They don't outright say what their thoughts are, so a little bit kind of Black Mirror-esque. And I was thinking of game mechanics and how would this work out? How would you know, like, whether or not you succeeded or not, or what the challenge rating there was. So the characters are aggressive or very friendly to you, or neutral characters. If they were aggressive characters, they have absolutely no patience for you and they wanted their food right away. If they were friendly characters, they're willing to wait a little bit longer. So from left to right, left is some original sketch, and then the right-hand side is what the design ended up looking like. There are a lot of elements to consider, a lot of difficulties in having everything be very clear as to what's going on. But I think what I really love about game design with storytelling is that you can do so many iterations until you really hit the nail on the head with that. Again, another sample of, like, what the dialogue looked like originally and then what it ended up being like. Here's a little GIF as a sample of, like, what that dialogue might be like. So they would come interact with you. If they had something to say, they would say it. Depending on how you answered, you would create either more customers for yourself or less. You could create fans or more aggressive characters, which would make you lose the game faster. And this is just a still frame of it all. So your only bar in this whole game is your level of humanity, which only increases through talking to your customers. This is a little bit more of an expressive. So as you get to know the people that are coming into your restaurant, much like my experience with Think Coffee, the more that I talked to people, the more I figured out who I was in relation to them and what they were bringing to the table. And they also get more expressive. So if you've seen a customer for more than one day, then they become brighter, more vivid, a little bit more animated than the figures that you start out with. Obviously, like a huge challenge was trying to figure out what structure worked for the story, because it was originally a very linear story, very simply, and then this is what it ended up actually being like, where I separated it by day as to the possible actions that you could take in the day. It was just a very different way of thinking about things, and how can you hit those markers, not expecting someone to know like what they're doing in there. So you have to control all of that. And then this was just a very simple sample of the dialogue. So what I used to make this was twine, and I realized very quickly into the iterations that I needed to do some looping dialogue, because someone clicking on one option is not going to get the entirety of the other answers. So that became more difficult too. Twine, like Blender, is free for anyone to use if you want to start on your own story like that, and it appears as an HTML file, so you can actually test and reiterate your story over and over again. And the final form of this story is as an arcade cabinet, and he's right downstairs. I think a really surprising thing for me was just how much time I've seen some people like actually playing it, because I always had to create it with the assumption that if it's an arcade cabinet, someone might not be willing to spend the time. And I think that was one of my biggest fears going into the project, was, is someone going to get my story just from one day of play, or as long as they're willing to sit. And I was pleasantly surprised. Thank you. So the question is, how long is the game end to end? And I tested it out the last time I tested it out. It was about 30 minutes. Yeah. But it gets progressively faster if you know the mechanics, if you get used to it. Do I think I could see it as a series of games? Yes. My hope and intention is that the next iteration of this story will actually exist in his next form. So I plan on making more arcade cabinets with the stories further on of his other selves. So going from a 3D background to a 2D background. Yeah, it was super challenging, but I think what made everything so much easier is that if you're trying to work on something super complicated, it really helps to ask, because people are very willing to work with you and answer all of your questions. And there's a lot of free software available as well, and tutorials. I think working with 3D informed a lot of what I was actually doing in 2D, such as like I wouldn't have made it an arcade cabinet probably if I wasn't so familiar and comfortable with the medium. I really encourage people to use as much as they possibly can in experimenting and trying to find the true medium for your story, really. So I think what really excites me about this medium, especially going into a combination of programming, digital art, and three-dimensional objects, is that I can go back to things like, I don't know if anyone's been to the arcade cabinets with like Mech Warriors, where you're physically in the robot, but there's so many things that you can do, combining crazy things together to make three-dimensional forms that work on their own and can have a life of their own within. So if I would choose my medium based on the story, Absolutely. I think one of the most important things that this program has taught me is that you have to really find what speaks for your subject matter. Like Stable, which was the comic I would not have envisioned as a video game. Definitely stay true to the story itself and do it in the medium that is appropriate. I would love to continue making video games, but I think that consideration has to always be there going forward. Yeah. So is there a place for you to license your work? Absolutely. The platforms that we were using, Thomas was using Unity and I was using GameMaker. If you work with a small team or if you work by yourself, I think you can pay a certain fee for an upgraded version where you are automatically able to license your work. And I think in addition to that, if anyone's like interested in pursuing something like that or taking a class and like taking a taste of this world, I was involved with playcrafting. I actually took a narrative game writing class. Is that right? Yeah. And the classes are fairly affordable with industry leaders teaching you, and the community is only growing, so if you really do have a story that you think would work as a game or as a different experience, it doesn't really have to only be a game. There are people willing to work with you, and you can totally license all of that yourself. Yeah. Thank you.